Phil, welcome to Curated Questions, my friend.
Oh, thank you. And I'm happy to be here. I'm just wondering who you were talking about a moment ago. I want to meet that guy.
It allows you to just further come into your own, if you will, then.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I mean, I've had worse things said about me for sure. No, but seriously, I'm very humble. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, I always like to start at the same point, and that's to help baseline and to give a little bit of background story. When did you first understand the power of questions?
The first time I was told no. Probably.
Right,
I don't remember
more.
that. It's happened so often. I remember listening to, this isn't the answer yet. We'll get there in a second. Okay. I remember listening to something my brother had pointed out. It was an interview with a psychologist who was describing parenting in the new era and the lack of effectiveness of relationships where parents wanted to be their children's friend. And these kind of discussions that people would have, how entirely unproductive they might be. And that really when a child is told no and asks why, they're not really looking for an explanation. They're looking to change your mind. And in kind of a strange journey forward many years later, it occurred to me that the same thing really applies to the kind of organizational leadership work that I do, and what the power of questions is and what the disempowerment of some other questions more likely tends to be. You have to understand the dynamics around questions to be a great question maker. And I had really taken a lot of understanding about that role of question maker from one of my mentors. And he spent quite a bit of time hurting my brain, as I sometimes like to say it, to understand things like that. I'm referring to a Dr. Thayer, who I had studied with for a number of years.
What did that mentoring from him, apprenticeship from you look like? So we've had previous conversations about some of the different organizations you've been a part of. How did that actually work between the two of you relationally?
It's a funny story, actually. I'll give you the background and then tell you why it's funny. I was actually a fairly well-recognized chair in the organization called Vistage, in their community, of which there were probably 500-600 chairs worldwide at that point. And I was invited about maybe 10 years into my tenure with them to a select group that Dr. Thayer wanted to invite into a 2-year master's program on leadership arts and science. And Dr. Thayer had been a fairly renowned academic many years prior, kind of renounced academia, had gone on to work in the field and had written some amazing things, had accomplished very many amazing things. And I thought this was just an enormous opportunity and privilege. And it turned out to be better than that.
Wow.
Lee had a style where he insisted on almost only asking questions. He had this little game he would play. It was that if you somehow put a question mark at the end of a statement, it was still a question. So, there's the old joke about Jewish mothers. I grew up Jewish, so I can say that. And something about answering questions with questions, And Lee did this just incessantly and relentlessly. And for the first year and a half I worked with him, I felt like I could never get an answer out of him. He always turned around my question into a much more powerful question that I had to avoid being stumped by. And he was very, very good at it. And it trained me to be able to think more clearly in the formation of questions. So it was the training that I got both to survive the experience with Lee and also to more clearly understand why he used that as a foundation for the approach to leadership, both developing it and executing it, that he was famous for. it was valuable also because my training as a Vistage chair was such that my role in the coaching element of this, and there's coaching and facilitation and mentoring, but on the coaching side was to be as entirely Socratic as I might. The suggestion was that I shouldn't ever provide answers, just question people, just interrogate their reality. Some people would call it be a burr in their saddle. And that's impractical. I don't do that. And I never did it entirely. But learning how was seminal in terms of reaching that point where I really understood the power of questions because I could experience it, not just as a theoretical point, but in terms of getting people to think, which was really the objective of the coaching part of my being a chair.
It sounds like he was very intentional about doing it. So
more than intentional. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no.
So this was just, he was very much leaning into, I see value in engaging with people via this way. And he made that conscious choice to do it. It wasn't that he was just seeking to be recalcitrant and argumentative or anything like that. But
he was doing that too.
Oh,
no, and it's important to put it in that context. Yeah, this came natural to him, I'm sure, but he was extremely intentional and he had refined that. And it was an incredible learning experience for me, to the point that the people who I have worked with since are all, I would say, impressed when I try to teach them the art of asking questions, how easily it comes to me and how difficult it is for them. And I let them know that there is a skill development here. And it's just starting with a knowledge. If you understand what it means to ask a powerful question, as I put it, and then learn how to do it, you still need to practice it. And you might have to practice it for a long time before you get fluid and then eventually fluent in the kind of question asking that, or question formation first. It's not, and that's important. It's not asking questions. It's how you form these questions and have a very clear intention behind doing it. And I think that Lee was a master at that. And I think I've gotten pretty good since then.
What are steps for, one or two steps, if you will, for going down that path towards mastery? So if somebody's, let's make up somebody that's just out of college, let's say, beginning of their career, they hear this and they're like, all right, you got my interest piqued. How do I go about doing that?
Yeah, there's a simple but not easy first step. And that's understanding that we operate either in learning mode or knowing mode at any point in time. And that we can't really form the kinds of questions that work in this kind of vein from a place of knowing. It comes from genuine curiosity. And we cultivate curiosity and we define what it means to be curious by choice when we understand what learning mode looks like, and the fact that, I believe anyway, most of us have been indoctrinated in knowing mode for a whole host of reasons.
Yeah.
And in fact, I believe we've been trained since the first moment we entered the realm of formal education out of our home, that we've been all through, that it's just safer to have the answers, to have the right answers. And one of the biggest struggles for leaders when I start to work with them is the fact that they are answer men and answer women, and they feel responsible to having the right answers for people. And then there's a whole cascade of problems, because then people depend on me for having the answers. More importantly, they are defaulted to not needing to have the answers. It becomes a whole dynamic of what leads to struggles and failures in leadership, I think. So the first step, just back to it, is learn what is knowing mode versus learning mode, how to get into learning mode, recognize when you're there, and then work on experiencing curiosity as a state of being, not a state of doing. You don't do curious, you have to be curious. So there's a certain amount of just self-awareness and a certain degree of humility. Because when I say I am curious, what I'm also broadcasting is I don't know.
That choice of words, or as you stated, you have to choose to be, not do, curious. And so a friend of mine, Lynn Borton, she's got a podcast called Choose to Be Curious. And so when you said that, I'm like, intentional or not, right? Her podcast is not called Choose to Do Curious.
Yeah.
But rather to be. And it's been my experience that the expectation is, yes, I have to have the answers. And that's the world in which I live in to be successful in the workplace. And at least defining that, am I in learning mode or knowing mode? That's a beautiful first step to just understanding, where am I right now? Where am I spending most of my time? What does that look like in different circumstances? Are there indicators other than just the things that come out of my mouth? Do they end with a question mark other than how Lee was doing it? What are some indicators that I'm being versus doing?
Well, so again, self-awareness. There's a degree of emotional intelligence that I think is foundational to being in learning mode. So I haven't really thought about that. Are there indicators? Language is the biggest indicator. When I teach people interviewing, I use a 3C technique. And the first is I ask you to evaluate, as a person curious, and then what do they care about and whether they're capable of doing what it is. It's just a process that we've developed. And the curiosity part, I define as an interview process of listening to how people respond. Do they respond with absolute certainty or with more of a sense of humility? It kind of shows up. There's a degree to which people are emphatic about their beliefs, and that could be fine because that's how we learn what they care about and how much they care about that. But the actual response to well-crafted questions, again, questions beget questions and answers beget new questions, and all that in an inductive kind of an exploration of things versus deductive, where you're always just going for the answer. Inductive is going where the questions take you. But being a little bit deductive in that sense, so when I interview people or teach people to interview, you're listening for the clues. If a person says, no, absolutely not, I mean, it could just mean, no, absolutely not. Or it could be more that they are afraid to say, well, most of the time or sometimes. And that's an indicator to me that they are in knowing mode. They have to demonstrate certainty. So too much certainty is an indication that you're not curious. It shows up in behavior later on in terms of curiosity is what makes people coachable. And curiosity is what breeds innovation. So if you see people who are very rigid in their beliefs, it doesn't just, to me, indicate that they have strong beliefs. It means to me more that they are hiding behind their certainty and they are incurious by design very often or default. I think most people are more comfortable not being curious, just especially the more successful that you get. And there are all sorts of exceptions to that. Think back to your earliest experience in school, and did any of your teachers ever pose a question to you academically to which they didn't have a specific answer in mind? And the answer is, generally not.
Right.
It's not that we're trying to weed out the incurious people. We're really trying to pluck the gems who show up curious and hold on to those. That's the first clue that we got a good one. I think another clue about people being curious is more personality present.
Hmm.
And we recognize when people are being arrogant because it makes us feel a certain way. But if instead of worrying about how that makes me feel, I say, well, what is it about that person? And generally, you could recognize that it's, again, that absolute certainty, maybe about something they don't know what they're talking about. But even if you presume that they're an expert, you recognize that it's a protection mechanism, I think, is what it comes across. I use this example, Ken. I don't remember where I formulated it, but somewhere along the line, my daughter was in a pre-med program at Stony Brook University, which has a huge organic chemistry class population, because organic chemistry in pre-med is designed to filter out anyone who is not willing to make themselves completely miserable and struggle. I mean, and my daughter indicated there were always a 20% back to Pareto who were just so brilliant they did this without any concern. But she was more like the average person and knew that this was going to be grueling 2 semesters. And she explained to me that on the first day, it wasn't even a professor, talk about arrogance. They send a teaching assistant typically to do it. And the teaching assistant writes this long organic chemistry formula on the board, and it stretches way across, and it's just incomprehensible, and said something to the effect that you're going to need to know what this means and why it's true. And look to your left and look to your right, because only one of the 3 of you will achieve that. The other 2 of you will fail. And if you need this to, for example, get into medical school, you better think about accounting or phys ed or something else, something ridiculous that order.
Yeah.
So it was just an intimidation tactic, right? And it was a parlor trick. We know this wasn't real, but it still was kind of revealing. And I remember telling my daughter, that's exactly what I've been talking about. What if that teaching assistant, or better yet, the actual professor came in and said, at the end of 2 semesters, you're going to look at this. And instead of being able to explain why it's true, some of you are going to begin to wonder, what if it wasn't?
Wow.
And
that would change things.
And I said, the brilliant kids that don't really care, but who's going to become inspired? This now has purpose. It isn't just a meat grinder where I have to try to survive and dodge the blades and get out whole. And I think that's what indicates to me both what learning versus knowing mode looks like, and then sometimes how difficult it is for some people to get out of knowing mode. And that's really what we're trying to help people do. We're not trying to teach you how to be in learning mode. We were born that way. But it's like trying to climb back in the womb for some people.
There's certainly risk, because now if I have to risk not knowing or going into that questioning mode, because for the last umpteen years, I've gone through all the school and everything else that said that the primary way that you're going to be graded in life is knowing. That's our primary indicator. And now the fact that you've been able to make it to college, and if you have any of that curiosity left in you and you're willing to express it at that point, that almost seems to be unicornish.
Or stupid. Or stupid.
Yeah. Right.
And I'll share that. No, I'll share that experience. It was in my sophomore year of college, which I never graduated, by the way. I never completed my undergraduate degree. Because it turned out I was just too curious for the system in one regard. And I mean that I'm not really joking, but I realize it sounds that way. But I remember I had gotten involved in all sorts of extracurricular things while I was in school, one of them being politics, in both very regular forms of politics. I was elected to the student council. I was appointed to a student advisory board to the governor of Ohio, and then I was selected for the National Student Lobby. And this was all with the pretext that I was going to become a lawyer and probably a politician. And I think my parents would have been pleased if I had actually done all that. And I remember being so absorbed in all these other things that I was not really paying attention to my classwork. I had been used to not studying much to get by. That was my MO through high school. I was very good at knowing that I could trick the system, and those that worked really, really hard got A's, and I could prove that you could do almost nothing and get a B. And
wow,
I'm not proud of it, but it had its benefits back then. And it wasn't how I approached college at that point, but it was knowing that I had that in my back pocket, that I wasn't particularly worried, except that at the very end of the semester, I had realized that it was absolutely impossible for me to complete everything that needed to be completed to pass all my classes. On some level, maybe pass any of my classes. I had just really messed up in that regard because there were papers that I hadn't handed in. I'd gotten extensions, whatever it was. My back was against the wall. And for a couple of days leading into that finals week, when the classes were all suspended and everyone just kind of hunkered down, drank a lot of coffee or whatever, and stayed up and crammed for their finals and stuff. In the days preceding that, when I went to assess what effort, Herculean or beyond, was going to be required, I came to the conclusion there was just no way. I mean, I was in trouble. And I thought, well, I can probably pull off the trick of just going in there and making it work and getting out with a B or a C, just pass. Right. And instead, I was looking around and I was observing the behavior of an entire university class, maybe the entire university, going into this kind of strange cramming mode. Whether there were people like myself who were hopelessly behind, or people that were just doing their best to come up with a 4.0 grade point to get into medical school or whatever they were doing. But it was a surreal environment. And it occurred to me it was highly unnatural. And instead of jumping into it, I decided to step out of it. And I observed. I literally, for 2 days, just studied these like they were specimens in petri dishes or on microscope slides or something, cages, up the telescope. I just, from every angle, was just looking at this. And I realized that that was my approach to college. I was always in learning mode. I just wasn't learning what I was told I needed to. So I think I've taken away something about a rambunctious kind of curiosity that is often the hallmark of, I'm not putting myself in the category of some of these brilliant thinkers and massively successful entrepreneurs, but very often they're the people who do not conform to the process that has been designated as the only way to do this. And you'd think about the Elon Musks of the world. I remember a headmaster at my son's high school. He went to private school with a Spectrum kind of a kid before they knew Spectrum. And headmaster told me, despite everything I promised you about getting your son educated in a proper way, he won, I lost. I'm sorry. But take comfort in the fact that in all the years I've been doing this, I recognize that kids like your children, the C students, end up being the ones who all the A students work for.
That is a kind reassurance when it could have been just very critical.
It was very interesting because there's no easy answer to what predicates a pursuit of learning mode. I think it's when you recognize there's value in it and you remember that you're capable of being curious.
Also, take out of that the intentional watching and observation that you did. I realized everybody was hunkered down and doing all the things that they were seeking to do. As I think about the rhythms of the work that I've done before, so if we an easy one is to point to the budget cycle. It happens every year, and we know all the steps that are going to be happening. I think I've probably missed opportunities to just observe what's happening. We know these things happen every year.
Sure.
And it comes back to the question of what is the equivalent of piano scales in your work? So how are we practicing? And am I reflecting at the end of a week, the end of a day on a particular budget, on milestones, and saying, what went well? What didn't go well? How did other people handle it? And bringing in that curiosity to observe, to be able to learn. And now I can take that forward for next year and be more prepared. I don't think that I did the observation like that. I was more stuck in, for the most part, the knowing mode because it was, quote, tied to execution rather than curiosity mode and learning mode.
Yeah, that's that whole expert mode trap. And you do need to be expert. It doesn't take anything away from that, but it extends to what I consider competent or competence, which is beyond expert to being able to accomplish optimally what needs to be accomplished. Sometimes I'll use the phrase, the execution at the level that you accomplish what matters most. And I consider that my definition of competence. So again, as an expert, sometimes we fear doing anything other than best practices, if you want to call it in a formal sense, what we do. You don't experiment when it's real time, when it's go time. And you shouldn't, by the way. I kind of put this in the framework of what I call the cycle of certainty and uncertainty. And I believe that we should spend 25% of our time in certainty. And it's also equally called, the uncertainty is the curiosity part. So I sometimes just call it the cycle of curiosity and certainty. It's probably more accurate. And basically what it suggests as a process is that when you approach a problem or a challenge or a task, but a budget is a problem. I mean, you really, if you consider it, it's all problem solving. Otherwise, it's just bookkeeping, right? That's the difference. So in this cycle, I break it into 4 quadrants. Quadrant 1, if you can imagine, in the upper left, and then we're going to come around the cycle again. So you go from upper left, upper right in that direction, clockwise. Okay. So we start off with just exploration, wild curiosity. What's possible? No wrong answers, kind of a thing, as we say, no crazy ideas. And I did this actually just recently with a client, a CEO that I work with for his leadership team. He came up with a challenge to the entire leadership team. And I was in there as a observer, coach, and facilitator. I wasn't facilitating this meeting though. And it was that whole idea saying, what do we think our actual stretch budget is? And then what would it take to 3x that? And without questioning whether we can or whether we should, and that's another thing, this process of always should we before can we. We said, forget about whether we should do this. So the first section of this is just abject curiosity and blue sky it and whatever you do. So you ask the kind of questions that are even borderline ridiculous with some element of discipline behind it. We have a time limit on this. Then you take all of your answers and questions, and then you layer it next to the things that you actually know. So you balance what I'm curious about versus what I know. Well, I know, for example, we can't do this, it's illegal, or we can't do this, it's immoral, or we can't do this, we don't have time or money, or all the normal constraints that you would go through. Yeah. So the first one is pure, learning mode. Now we're using a little bit of our knowledge because learning is not and curiosity is not inescapable from reality. It has to be grounded. So
Right.
the next step is you form what you've imagined with what you know, and now you come up with a solution. So you are extremely curious, mostly curious. And then when you go into execution, you become entirely certain.
Mm.
It's this kind of extreme execution or radical certainty or any number of ways you can describe that condition. And you just execute to the extreme without any hesitation. And the way that's been described is if you're going to jump over a stream, you run up to it and you might continue to judge whether you think you can do it. But the moment you have liftoff, if you hesitate, you get wet, always. So you go into that kind of extreme or radical execution mode, which is your knowing mode, certainty. And then as soon as you either get wet or get to the other side, but let's just say you got to the other side, the objective, the first thing you do at that point is say, okay, were we lucky or were we skilled? What could we have done better? What could have gone wrong that we hadn't thought about until we were in the middle of the air? All those kind of questions, those follow-up postmortems, if you will, on both successes and failures, right? 3 of these modalities are learning mode, but 1 is knowing mode. And I think that's the recipe for life. You spend a quarter of your time in certainty and the rest in uncertainty.
I'm glad that you amplified on that, because I was a little bit surprised when it was only 25% in certainty mode. I was like, that's a small number, it seems like. And so I appreciate you differentiating the other 2 kind of curiosity modes. It's going to take up that other 75%.
Remember, all the action occurs in that 25%.
Gotcha.
The product of your success isn't in the right action. It's the right thinking that goes into that action. It's like my writing. I find that the time I spend writing is fairly small relative to the amount of thought that contributes to what I'm writing about. Another way to look at it is when someone says, how long does it take you to do that? Why are you going to charge me so much? It looks like an hour's worth of work. And you say, well, it's a lifetime's worth of experience and development, and you're not paying me for the hour I'm doing this. And even understanding that requires a certain element of asking yourself the right questions or asking someone else questions to help them understand. That's another element here.
How do you think about formulating questions? Frameworks or dedicating the time to figuring out the question, setting aside specific time for formulating the question to understand what you're going after, or more iterative?
Sure. Well, yes, there's a process, and there's a difference first. I don't consider good questions and bad questions, smart questions and dumb questions. I love that expression. There are no dumb questions. Well, of course there are. Plenty of dumb questions. I really separate intentional questions, and that's a big thing. I'm talking about the realm of intentional questions. And by intentional, I don't mean that I'm looking for an answer. I'm looking to create an outcome. So, the kind of questions you ask when you're just needing data. How much does that cost? I don't care if you say, how much does that cost? What's it cost? How much? You know what I'm saying? Inconsequential. But there are very consequential questions, in my view, particularly around things like leadership. And so that's really the context here. And then I divide it into basically powerful questions and everything else. And I define a powerful question more in its form than its formulation, in its result, really. So I define a powerful question as one that is open-ended, obviously, because it cannot be answered in a single word, yes or no. Ideally, it can't be answered in a short sentence. But more importantly, it cannot be answered immediately. It requires a pause. A person has to actually think to come up with an answer. So the first outcome intentional questions seek is to cause the person you're communicating with to think, not just react. And then the craft comes in two forms. One is, what do you need them to think about? What are you trying to get them to think about? And there's always that chance that you're asking rhetorical kinds of questions where my intention is to make you look like a fool, make you feel ashamed, make you feel punished somehow. And there are times that you can ask that. And to my surprise, Lee Thayer gave me an antidote to that. The question to ask a child when they've underperformed, in his view, was, is that the best you can do?
Mm.
And I love that. I wish I could go back and raise my children again, asking that more often than whatever spewed out. Part of it is knowing emotional intelligence, awareness, knowing how a person is going to respond and knowing what you're intending to do. The harder part, though, in preparation, besides knowing outcomes, is just that skill of forming those kinds of questions. And before that, actually having the wherewithal to pose questions rather than make statements. So the first step of the process when I'm coaching people in teams and training is to have them practice. And we'll practice in a workshop setting or in the sessions that we do. But typically with the CEOs, I'll ask them to keep a journal and just be aware, where did I miss an opportunity to ask a powerful question and instead gave an order or asked an disempowering question? And not beat yourself up about it, but just kind of start to keep, what gets measured gets done kind of an attitude. Just see that you will improve over time. This is not something I do well because I just started it yesterday. I've been doing this for 10 years. And it's a problem that when you get practice at something, it sometimes makes it look easy. And it's not. And I still work on it less hard, but I still have to be mindful of it, meaning in stressful situations, I don't use my best resources. And I'll do what everyone else does. And worse than a lot of people do. So the journaling is something that helps. So the first level is, when could I have used a powerful question? Or if I attempted and I failed and I ended up not finding the question, just make note of it. And sometimes I've had follow-up conversations with people. They'll mark the situation and they go, I don't even know what I could have asked. And in a short while, instead of that, they just say, I just missed the opportunity. What I should have asked is. And I think if you keep your awareness on that, you'll get better over time. And this is one of those things where there is no perfect. And just a little better turns out to be a lot better. From a structural perspective, it's just becoming aware of those two things. One is that they are open-ended and that they are thoughtful. That when I say things that provoke people emotionally, they're not going to pause. They're going to snap back, which is why that question, is that the best you can do, is so powerful, because it doesn't get that emotional reaction. Why did you fail your test?
Yeah.
Did you study? Do you care about, and all those kind of questions as parents I've said. What were you thinking? Why weren't you thinking? I care about my kids. I know how it lands when you say, is that the best you can do? And when they're silent, and by the way, in questioning, silence does the heavy lifting. That pause in between and then not jumping on it afterwards, you end up following up with something like, oh, I'm disappointed. I really thought I could have expected better. And it's not quite laying a guilt trip. For the executives, I'll say, you know what? I take ownership of this. I overestimated what you could do. I'm not sure I was wrong, but you seem to believe it.
Wow. Coming in with the heart and being able to create that space for engaging honestly about whether you hit the mark or not. I almost shudder to think of how difficult it is for many CEOs to find that kind of space to be able to have that conversation. Because if you're supposed to be leading and hitting the ball out of the park every time, and then, yeah, there's just not a lot of places to be able to have that conversation to be fully transparent about it.
Yeah. I mean, it is probably the most significant part of the challenge because the skill set isn't really that complicated. Maybe some of it is intuitive, and I think I'm probably intuitive, maybe more than many in that area. Maybe I've been practiced longer than I've been intentionally practicing. Even work as a photographer. What made my photography interesting to me was the voyeurism of it, the framing. And framing is a function of curiosity. How can something look different in different ways, perspective and angle, and how does light hit things? I mean, you're posing all these kind of internal questions, and I think creativity does that. But the executive, leadership is an art. It really is. And again, that was something that Lee Thayer emphasized to a great degree. And he and I discussed, debated, mostly agreed upon. He just said leadership is a performing art. And we get hung up in management science, and science of management should be about things, not about people. We manage things, we lead people, kind of a separation on this. And the interesting thing that I've been using for the last maybe 3 or 4 years is an assessment tool that kind of lays out some visual clarity and some definite measures around the tendencies that support that kind of capability and show a pathway for the kind of development, personal development and leadership that transform people who tend to be reactive to being more resourceful or creative. And there's a strong correlation between leadership effectiveness as defined by, this is called the LCP 360 leadership circle that we use, and a correlation between leadership effectiveness and the success of a business measured among their peers. So it's easy to get people to understand that this makes sense. For me, when I see past the broader range of what we would consider more optimal tendencies and the ones we want to kind of form habits to leave behind, leads to the capability of forming great questions, of making space for that, because it talks about relating. It talks about being seen as a mentor and being curious, all the emotional intelligence involved in being able to regulate our emotions when they would otherwise get in the way. And then working towards being seen as authentic, that people see us as saying what we mean and meaning what we say and understanding when we know what we're talking about. So it's not an isolated process of just saying, here, snap my finger, or now you are a great question maker.
Yeah.
Even if you were, it doesn't mean you still will be tomorrow. It's not a credentialing process.
As you had mentioned earlier, right? It's along the skills. It's more in a skill category. So skill can atrophy, right? If we're not keeping at it and paying attention to it and practicing our scales, if you will,
Yeah. I was going to say something about the practicing of the scales, actually. And this goes towards what I consider skills, knowledge are driven by talent, but skills and knowledge are competencies. You can acquire knowledge, you can develop your skills. Talent is very overrated in terms of competencies because really all it ever does is enhance your ability to either acquire knowledge or hone your skills. And then there's credentialing, by the way, as a competency. If you want to drive a car, you need a license. If you want to practice medicine, whatever it might be, you have a podcast license, don't you?
No,
Gee,
I just keep putting them out. Yeah. Just keep doing it.
So in reality, experience speaks much more than credentials in the real world, is what I'm suggesting. Credentials only when needed, very rarely. But the objective is to take the competencies and then move that to competence. As I said earlier, it's when you can accomplish what matters most with what you need to do. And there are plenty of people who are highly educated and can't do anything with it. They get big degrees and they wait tables or drive cabs. That kind of people, or the really difficult ones who can't do, so they teach, or I'll talk no action. All that comes from not bridging to being competent. When my kids, two of my youngest kids were just naturally talented musicians, and we had a really strong music program in the district where my kids went to school. My daughter played violin. My son played orchestral bass, stand-up bass. And they were in the advanced orchestras, and those advanced orchestras would be juried for different programs, competitions. Sometimes they would be invited to countywide or statewide individual participation in those programs and orchestras or celebrations, whatever they were. And then the state of New York, where we live, also would rate kids. The New York State Music Association gave kids different level rankings. Was never sure what the value of that was, but the educators thought it was pretty important. So anyway, my kids would routinely be auditioning for something. And I couldn't play their instruments, but I could coach them. And their teachers, whether it was the in-school instruction or their private instructors, would teach them how to start and end the piece. In string instruments, they would work with what would be known as the fingering to make sure they're fingering the notes properly so they can make the changes. They would review the phrasing. They would make sure that they could make the changes and play it often enough or repeatedly so that they could play it. And then it would come time about a week or so before when they would need to be practicing for the audition. And that's when Dad would come in and make them miserable, because I would work with them and I can read music. And I've been a musician all my life, not a very good one on most levels, and not certainly a formal educator. But I would have them play the piece. And I'd work with them and I said, okay, do that again. Do that again. And we'd go through it until they had all the pieces clear, what their teachers mostly had gotten them to. Okay, and then when they'd get to the start to the end, they'd finally just say, okay, I got it. And I would be like, no, now we start. I said, because everything you did was learning. Now it's practice. And the purpose of practice is twofold. One is you're going to practice out as many of the mistakes you are likely to make. Over and over again, you're going to practice those out to the extent that you can, but that's not the most valuable aspect. The real trick is to be so fluid and confident that when you do make a mistake, you just continue on without a pause.
Just keep bridging it and keep
and the mistake just evaporates. The juror will know you did it, and your recovery without hesitation will eliminate almost all the consequence, versus the kids that get halfway through a piece and make a mistake and they go, ah, and they're like, and they stop or they cry or they throw, I taught my kids, you just don't do that. You don't have to do that. In fact, it's more impressive when you show that you can not do that, because everyone makes mistakes. And I apply the same thinking to learning how to ask great questions or powerful questions. The practicing isn't that there's a right way and a wrong way to do this. It's that you have to just keep doing it. And my coaching is aimed at ensuring that they do it even though they don't think they're doing it well or well enough. Again, doing it a little better is a lot better. And then just remaining intentional about it.
Without naming names, how have you seen the impact of somebody coming in, not understanding the power of questions and just living life in knowing mode? How have you seen someone take this concept and how has it worked in their lives?
Let me think of it and first address it in terms of my clients. I think the greatest satisfaction that I get from this is seeing the kind of reframing communication and their role as a leader changes how they think about their role as a leader. It changes their sense of potential. It changes their view. And I think it helps improve some of those really delicate underlying qualities of a more impactful, more influential leader, because questions help develop humility. The self-awareness to work on this does the same. We're building muscle in the creative, resourceful, emotionally more intelligent region of their being and their practice. And I think we're helping them elevate to a level of greater capability, more consciousness, really. It's like a leadership consciousness that's been described. I know that that's definitely true. And I think if you don't do anything but get better that way, you automatically improve your influence over the people in your organization. And then I see they'll say, well, now I need you to work with some of my people because I can barely do this. I can't teach this. And sometimes I do, and often I don't. I mean, because I point out, this isn't a matter of installing a program and when we run it, everything goes smoothly. There are so many other factors that have to come in. But just seeing an improvement in that awareness, I could recognize a change and they become more confident, even if they just become slightly more competent in terms of their leadership. So I get enormous satisfaction from that. In my life, I feel like I have much better rapport with people. I think I've shifted from trying to make people understand me to getting to know people by better understanding them. And that's not an intentional thing. It's a great question you asked me here. And I think it made me pause. That's
Excellent.
a powerful question right there.
Yeah.
And if I could make an even greater impact, if I could take this outside of the realm of leadership work and make the world just more aware of this, I'd be happy.
Coming back to the first part that you were talking about there, what flickered through my mind, is it true that staying only in learning mode, you will top out? If you bring in the curiosity and, in the knowing mode, that you'll top out in knowing mode.
Yeah.
But if you incorporate the learning mode, then that gives you far more room to grow and to learn. Is that a fair statement?
Oh, I think it's an absolutely truism, a true statement. There's no question about it. I don't know if the lyrics came out of The Lion King or not, but there's more to know than can ever be known, an attitude. You can't win. Einstein always said that knowledge has limitations. It's a constraint, but imagination is limitless. And I always equate imagination and curiosity. I don't know that they're exactly the same thing, but I do know that imagination stirs curiosity, and I know that imagination requires curiosity. So I think there may be two halves of a whole or something like that.
Mm.
But you can't solve problems with the same solutions. The same level of thinking that caused your problem won't get you out of it attitude. And I think that knowledge acquired does either become or at least appears like arrogance, and it doesn't draw people together. I think you can separate people through your knowledge. I think you can put people off. I mean, I've done that a lot of my life where I'm clearly the smarter person in a small crowd, and I can make a point of it if I want to. And there's never a reason to. And I'm not the smartest person in most rooms, especially the rooms I put myself into. But that's where people make the world smaller, when they've got to be the smartest person in the world. You just have to find a lot of people less smart than you. And that's a -0 game in the world. I think for leaders, the other part is, how do you surround yourself with people who challenge you to be more curious? Not that they have to supplement your knowledge with what their capabilities or knowledge is, but I think the real benefit is, A, it demonstrates that humility of surrounding yourself with smarter, more capable people. And the other part is it just keeps you curious. It's like my walking around that university and watching all these students that eventually went to law school and medical school, and who knows what they did, and I flunked that quarter pretty well. I don't think I suffered too terribly for it, but that was just luck. No, I think that what you learn, and this isn't exactly right, isn't what you learn becomes who you are. It isn't that the product of your learning. Maybe it's how you learn becomes who you are. Lee Thayer's little sing-song kind of quote was, growth equals life. Life is a function of growing, and growing for the most part is learning. Influence comes from that too, because I've always felt that you can't change anyone's beliefs for them. People change their beliefs when we are able to and willing to learn something new. That's how beliefs change. If I want to change my belief, I study something about it. If I want to help other people shift their beliefs, I have to demonstrate curiosity and hope that they will share some of that curiosity and maybe learn something new. I think that whole idea about why being in learning mode and making it contagious is just such a powerful way to live your life. We've all met people like that who are just contagiously curious. If you're lucky enough to have an educator, a teacher in your life who really inspired you, chances are it was because they were just itching to learn things all the time. And the people that were really erudite and professorial, well, they're not generally that impressive to me, at least. I think most people find them boring. Maybe. Can I say that? A lot of people are going to hate that. The erudite and the pompous will find that solemnity, back to John Cleese.
They have every right to be offended, and that's fine. They can live in that world. So
I have to be careful. Some people have accused me of occasionally sounding that way. I think I'm, what's the word I want to use? Irreverent enough that no one thinks that I'm overly solemn about anything.
Well, yeah, I don't take it all that seriously, in that I absolutely see the need to be able to laugh at ourselves. I would hope that all those folks that fall into that category have a way to be able to access laughter and humor about themselves. Would be my heart
lighten
for
up,
them.
folks. Yeah. Lighten up, folks. Yeah.
You mentioned that people that inspire your learning and curiosity, it almost seems like that's a great kind of, for lack of a better term, kind of checklist. Who are the people that inspire you to greater curiosity and greater learning? And then what faces come to mind for that? Maybe for yourself, but also just for listeners, in that it's like, okay, if nobody comes to mind, am I missing out? So how can I go and cultivate that from whatever source?
Sure.
How can I get there such that, because there's a chance I'm missing out?
Yeah. I mean, another powerful question because it stumps me a little bit. Uh, there's a quicker, easier answer to this, and
Mm,
it's a secret.
love it.
And I've told many people this secret, and that is the people that inspire me to learn. All of them, I shouldn't say all of them are. Every one of my clients is that. My opportunity to sit down and coach people is what inspires me to learn. I learn from the conversations. I'm inspired to think about things. I'm inspired to figure out ways to be curious so as to be able to reflect with them on whatever it is that they need help sorting. And I kind of joke sometimes. I say, you're paying me to do this, but I'm getting the greatest value in terms of our conversation. Um, and I'm serious. That is true. That does happen. And I find sometimes when I do multiple sessions a day or over the course of a week, I find myself carrying insights that popped into my awareness from one conversation carries all week long. I refer to that as sometimes I just find a flavor of the month. And it's not in that over reductive kind of thing that now I'm just throwing one answer to everybody. It isn't that at all. It's just that, oh my goodness, this insight is universal. And when I find those things, and I do in that coaching. So the greatest source of this is in these very productive conversations that I have all week long with all the people I work with, and some more than others. Greatest inspiration for this was Dr. Thayer. Working with Lee shaped a lot of my understanding of how to be effective doing what I do. And that effectiveness is both a matter of calibrating into learning mode as necessary, and questions is the foundation of that. So I've never stopped being inspired by the experience that I had with Lee. And our relationship post my study became a little rocky because I think he saw me as a highly capable continuing voice of his work. And I saw his work as a foundation to build on, and he didn't want to be on the basement floor of anything but his life's work. If I were building a shrine, he would have been happy. Thinking of himself as a foundation, probably not so much.
Yeah.
And I've talked to his daughter, Joelle, about this a little bit. Lee was almost 90 when I was working with him.
Wow.
I would describe him to people at that time as extremely perishable with no specific expiration date. And he just kept going. But no, he inspires me, and I never will stop. I have a hero. And I always talk about the fact that I don't have heroes. When I was young in my training, people say, who are your heroes? It's a typical icebreaker kind of thing, or an inclusion, right? And I'd always say, and make stuff up. It was my parents, to a degree, were here. My mother is my hero. That's a whole other world. But she died when I was like 20 years old. She goes really into that hero hall of fame. But I've been inspired most about the work that I do. So I guess it's, again, foundational. I guess my people are the foundations.
Yeah.
About my issues about curiosity, because my thinking about leadership stems from Grace Hopper. And Grace Hopper.
She was Navy, right?
Yeah, she was. You would know something about that.
First female admiral, is that right?
Rear Admiral. First woman to attain rank of Rear Admiral.
Yep.
And she was just an auspicious person. She was recruited into the military after having established herself at MIT as a pioneer computer scientist. She was one of the progenitors of COBOL programming, and those teams built the first mainframe computers. I like telling the story that her notes about that mainframe, and it's early days of experimenting with what you would do with a thing like that. And of course, it was all built of solid state boards, transistors, and all that. And it was a huge machine, size of a factory room of some sort, and probably had less power than my Apple Watch, certainly had less power, computing power than I don't even know. But there was a situation that was noted famously where for some electronic or electrical reason, the whole thing just shut down. And they walked into this machine and examined all these circuit boards and discovered that a moth had flown onto one of the boards and burned up, and it was shorting out one of these boards. And in her notes is reflected that she found the bug and removed it. Hence, debugging in computer became a thing forevermore. And you can actually find the notes, and I think the bug is in the Smithsonian, although I don't know if it's still there. There may be a reason it's been removed. So the reason for my admiration of the Rear Admiral was that she famously said things like, most dangerous words in the language are, we've always done it this way. Mm. And I think that speaks to the curiosity of how else might we, and why do we do that? Conversely, she is also the person who coined the notion of sometimes being better to ask for forgiveness rather than permission. So again, that kind of...
I didn't realize that tied back to her as well.
That is hers. But what she said that really informs my work very directly was her statement that you cannot manage people. You manage things and lead people, and cited the fact that no great general ever managed their troops successfully into battle. And so everything about that has driven the work of Alps leadership for all these years I've been doing this. And I don't ever separate those thoughts from the person who they came from. And I saw her as someone who was intensely, well, brilliant, intensely curious, rather disciplined, which I'm not nearly as much, and then highly accomplished. And she has a legacy. So, I finally got the answer to the question after a lifelong of pursuit. Who are my heroes? She just pops right out. So yeah, I would say that what inspires me, I go a few layers deep to get to the foundation of it, but it's people who go out to happen to things. It's a Leonardo da Vinci quote. I'm going to read it so I get it exactly right for you here. It's very short.
Yep.
Leonardo da Vinci wrote, "It had long since come to my attention that people of accomplishment rarely sit back and let things happen to them. They went out and happened to things." And that's how I look at Grace Hopper, as someone who, I don't think she set out to happen to things. From what I've read, what I've researched or whatever, far from it. But she had a clock in her classroom that went backwards. I mean, that was just the kind of thing that she did.
Wow. Okay. I'm going to go do some research and go learn some more about her. I mean, I've got bits and pieces, obviously, but yes, they've definitely piqued the curiosity for a deeper dive.
You will understand why her nickname was Amazing Grace.
All right. That is a lookup for me. Wow. And so when roughly did you find out about her?
It was before I met Dr. Thayer. It was probably about 15 years ago. I didn't know that I was going to be a leadership person, much less expert or coach or anything. I kind of fell into this work when I was asked to become a chair with Vistage, as we talked about earlier. And about 5 years into this, I started realizing it was true when I was told that the first 5 years, if you're doing it right, are malpractice. And that's when I started wondering what it would take to actually do this well. it was such an impressive community of people that when I started, I remember thinking, I've just never experienced the caliber of humanity that I was invited into. And literally in my initial boot camp training, had been invited at the same time, at the same location, to a international conference of chairs who'd come in from all around the world. And it was called Tech at the time, not Vistage. And there were members that come in from different part of the world as well for this conference. And I remember just standing in this room, and there were about 200 of my future colleagues, very encouraging, very impressive, and very supportive of me. I just never felt that kind of support anywhere.
That's beautiful.
And they let me know that I was going to be in for a rough climb. It was the hardest thing any of them had ever done. They said, we're starting these groups and expect there to be dark days, and we've all gotten through, and if you need a light, come along, we'll help you get there, kind of thing. And I remember thinking on that first pass through, this is so impressive. If I could just climb up right into the belly of this thing, just climb up and be among everybody, encapsulated in a climate bullseye right into the middle, I will have accomplished something genuinely significant and meaningful to me. And it was 5 years later, it started to occur to me that aiming for the middle is the very definition of mediocrity. And that if you aim for the middle, you are just as apt to fall out the bottom as ever get to the top. So to get there, you have to aim high and then hope for the best. And by hoping for the best, I mean, is do everything you can to prepare yourself to either succeed or not. And I will just use that same observation and curiosity as I had when I was in college to observe what other people did. I became a speaker for the same organization, traveled around the country, spoke about 80 different groups. And I was more interested in just watching what other people were doing. What did their members look like? Because they looked different than mine. My concept of what kind of CEOs I was looking to approach. Were they older? Were they younger? Were they old white men, is how they used to describe most of the groups? Yeah. And I would meet the women chairs, and I was one of the youngest chairs at that point. I was like in my 40s, late 40s. And most people were fully gray. I didn't even have gray in my beard back then. And that's when it all crescendoed. And I discovered Grace Hopper in my attempt to understand, what am I doing here? And how to get through the dark days, as some people called it, the challenges, the failure, the fear, the imposter syndrome, all the stuff that is normal. It was very unnerving to receive a commendation of a Rookie of the Year, being a rookie after having been successful in my career and all this kind of stuff. But it was it was something else.
Oh, you've mentioned music and that you've got experience as a drummer. What do you think music has taught you, or what's the intersection, the Venn diagram overlap of questions and music?
It's back to creativity. There's an element of creativity in forming powerful questions, and it's an improvisational process. You can't read a script. You have to be able to listen to what's going on and improvise. And I've always appreciated jazz. It was something that Lee Thayer and I talked quite a bit about, because among his several PhDs, one of them was musical composition.
Wow.
He taught me that all creativity exists only because of the constraints placed upon them. Art is basically managing imagination with constraints. There's a certain amount of, call it notes on the piano that you can play, or strings on a guitar, or square inches on a canvas. So there's that element. I think the other part of it that's maybe more interesting to me is that the arts challenge what we know. Unless you're going to be intensely a realist, and I never found much value in people painting photographs.
Mm.
And there is value in it, and there's great skill in it. It's just that it's not what I look for. And in fact, I know that Picasso was a prodigy, and his father was an art teacher. And he went to a conservatory, and he learned how to paint by copying the work of the masters. And his work was really to the level of being forgeries. He was just so talented and able to do that, such that he showed that anyone could do that. And then he went into all this abstraction, brilliant stuff that's just so much more interesting. I think of the musical experience the same way. To play music, other than to read it, and I never was good at reading music, and I never studied and don't know anything about practical music theory and composition. I know what it is. I can't do it. Never wanted to. So particularly as a drummer, I'm always living in the future by just a beat or more. It's what are you going to do next? And after that. So the future doesn't exist yet. It's a form of imagination. It's structured imagination. It's informed imagination. So the fundamental question is, what do I do next?
So tying the imagery there with jazz and looking to the next note, just an obvious connection there in conversation and with coaching and in that moment of that next moment of the future. Where do we go? What is an effective question to be able to get to where we need to go? Seems like there's a lot of overlap.
A tremendous amount of overlap. Absolutely. And I think the people that are afraid of the unknown struggle with this. They want the script. They want to know exactly what I am doing, not wonder what I am doing next. And again, learning mode versus knowing mode. It's always safer to have the answers. It's not having the answers, I teach people, it's having the questions. And that just upsets the entire architecture of safe thinking. I think I find amusement in upsetting people that way. I really do. I don't suffer much from people who don't enjoy that. I've always said people who lack curiosity have no place in my life. I don't want them in business, and I really don't want them in my personal life. The people who are certain about things, I just don't have a lot of patience for it, I guess. And I don't have a lot of respect on some level. And I just distill it down. I don't need that in my life. And that does sound a little arrogant, a little elitist, maybe, but I think that's fair game for people. Surround yourself with curious people. And then the questions come more easily because they'll pull them out of you. People will pull, like you're doing here.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. So time has slipped away from us. So before we wrap up, I do like to ask folks, what is their right now question? So this is something beyond what's for dinner and who am I going to get married if I'm going to get married. This is coming back to the present moment or the season of life for you. So what is your right now question?
What will people remember about me when I'm gone? I was with a colleague in a conference in Edinburgh last September, and she brought this up. She said that her moral compass was, when I'm gone, will I be relevant to that person? Not if I made them happy, but will they think well of me? And she said she guided her decisions about what to do with that question, will people think well of me? And I don't know if I have the courage to say, will people think well of me? I just want to know if they'll remember me. She said the worst curse, she said hell is not that people think poorly, but that they don't even remember me. And that profoundness. And I learned a while ago the most disempowering question that anyone can ask, because I did ask myself, is what do I do now? It's just not a good question. You're doing what you can do now. And that idea that, will people think well of me, supposes that I just have to be something different than I am right now to ensure that. I need to be more deliberate, or I need to be more creative, or I need to be more patient, or I need to do something as a result of how I am. How will I be remembered? And I'm not planning on needing to have that happen anytime soon. not in the permanent sense, but I mean, there are people that I've lost touch with. I suppose it could be relevant, short of passing off this earth.
When do you think that question became pressing for you?
When I stopped worrying about things like mortality, when I stopped worrying about legacy and started thinking more about latency. Without going down a rabbit hole, in 2019, I was diagnosed with chronic lymphocytic leukemia and originally told it was a nothing disorder and got a frightening prognosis before we reached a point that the prognosis was correct in what was going on in terms of the diagnosis, but that I was really going to live a very normal, healthy lifespan without much interruption or disruption or consequence. And it lightened me up just quite a bit.
Wow.
That sense of feeling very mortal and at the same time very curious about realizing that I needed to discover what I needed to know. First thing I needed to know was who to trust, and found the right doctors and what I could understand to help and make informed decisions. And this summer, I had a possible side effect from the medication that I take, which makes me completely well. I am so healthy. I'm amazed.
Oh, that's fantastic.
And really I am. And one possible effect is some cardiac involvement, and you could go into AFib or such. But in the middle of June, after running a successful program and being exhausted, I noted to my wife that I felt dissociated during the day. I had felt unwell a couple of days prior, and my heart was pounding the night before. She said, "Your watch told you your pulse. What's your pulse?" I said, "Oh my God, it's 160. Oh. And my daughter, who's a cardiac provider, said, "Mom has to drive you to the emergency room now."
Now.
And you can't drive, and you have to go now. And amazing what happens when you enter an emergency room in that kind of cardiac event. People who have limbs hanging off are left waiting, and you get pushed right to the front of the line. And what's known as atrial flutter. And, wow. and I'm hooked up to a 12-lead EKG, and it looks like a 4th of July fireworks display. Things are moving fast. Flutter means that it's literally this sawtooth going on at this heart rate. And the machine has all sorts of alarms going off, both in terms of the rate and the abnormalities and all this thing. So it's literally like, and the doctor said, "Yeah, we're going to give you some meds, and we got this." He said, "This is not a problem. We can control this. The meds will slow you down and it probably won't disrupt the arrhythmia, but worst comes to worst, we're going to keep you overnight anyway. And tomorrow we'll talk to your cardiologist who, if it doesn't resolve, will simply cardiovert you." And that's when they shock your heart back into rhythm.
Okay. And
I'm sitting there watching this whole thing go around. And unlike that surrealistic experience of feeling numb, walking into the Mount Sinai Comprehensive Cancer Center, feeling like I didn't know what the world was going to be, or what terrible things were going to confront me, and will I die, and how awful and painful will it be, kind of a dread. This time I'm sitting there like a kid watching fireworks, and my wife, who's a registered nurse, looks at me and she said, "Are you nervous?" I said, "No." I said, "I'm fascinated." I said, "This is really interesting."
Endlessly curious now. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, just so if there's a benefit to curiosity, it's the relief of the anxiety that we find in the pursuit of certainty. Mm. And I don't know how to bottle that. I don't know how to prescribe that. I don't even know how to, really talk about it. But yeah, I think that's probably a great way to end us today.
Absolutely.
That's where all the hope is. Just get really curious, and the fear is just, it's gone.
That is a lovely spot to wrap it up. Yes.
Thank you, Ken.
Well, Phil, thanks for coming on, man. And thank you for sharing. Appreciate the work that you're doing with the organizations and the individuals you're working with and helping them to embrace the questions and get after that curiosity. Thank you.
Thank you very much.